accepted average, but now it's somewhere in the high 97, probably right where it goes.
I was 97.4, so I guess that's
You're
a little bit.
You need to rest. Right. Yeah.
And if you're at 99, that's bad, right? Or is it anything under 100 is fine?
I think it's probably abnormal to be overnight.
Hospitalization, where you're supposed to get checked out if you're like 101.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
I think 103 is like risking my life.
sorry.
We just talk to health professionals all the time, but we don't know anything.
So, you know, 89.
Your head? Yeah, you missed it.
It's possible.
I want to see something that's not in here. Like, do those get caught? The big fast?
Oh yeah, the TBU.
I don't know. Something needs to show me that it goes over.
Did you do a little laser or something?
I don't know. Do you see it later?
No, I should not. It was just like,
You just clicking?
yeah.
Is it not changing?
It's going up.
Yeah, it's all different
It
temperatures.
just seems.
Yeah. At least you can say where it is. Oh, look at the lights would be hot, right?
No.
30 degrees. They're frozen.
Just trying to get your message.
It didn't reply.
No reply?
But it did deliver.
Probably texting me. Going down hard.
I mean, usually whenever one of you guys doesn't respond, and he knows I'm with you, he'll just send something to me. So.
I want to get fired.
I don't know why she would think that. I guess that's probably her first time being maybe yelled at.
Being yelled at? Have you ever been yelled? Producer go anywhere, kind of, maybe, sort of?
I've been yelled at for not answering a phone before.
Low or high? Nothing's so high yet.
I don't know if I've ever yelled at
Maybe
a
more.
story related.
That's what Jim thinks that the same thing happened to him where it was like it should
Like
like
soccer
it just
songs.
super
Yeah.
secret.
That seems weird.
Okay, that seems right.
I mean, it took me a little cold, but probably not like 80 degrees.
It was like 90. I don't know about that.
It's kind of deep.
Were you agreed today for that stuff?
I told him I knew, and
I
I told him about John being.
had colleagues covering the stuff outside, so I was not, I wandered around my car, which you probably would.
But it's over there.
No, I
Anyway, he
was
done
not
it.
in speaker, so I just-
When you do listen to the sound, it sounds better.
Oh, yes. Because it's right up there by this spot from my mouth.
Mhm.
It's right here. Yeah.
You don't.
sounds like we're good.
Will do.
I'm ready for Christmas.
Means you don't Christmas.
But then when Christmas comes, unless you were wanting a new car and you got it, it's usually, and then it's done. You have
I
to
just
get-
like all the festivities.
Leading up to
around
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, me
But
too.
yeah, the actual day, it goes by pretty fast.
It's done in a half hour. Oh, nice, 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 nice. That's it. Unless you get a good PS4 game, then you're playing that for the next couple of weeks.
Now that you have little grandbabies, you get to watch them play with their toys.
Unless this Corona still, I haven't seen them since, well, it's my fault, it's K-State, I was busy on the weekends, couldn't go there. It truly has been since January, since I've seen
Oh,
them.
wow.
And then Corona took over and
Yeah.
I definitely not home. I'd be the terrible one to go there just because what we do, we're everywhere. I can't, you know, can I be 100% guaranteed that I'm not gonna bring it over? No, absolutely not. Nobody can, but especially with us when we're everywhere. And then my son, now he works at Dillon's, he just got a job there. So he's getting all that. Can't hear.
You certainly don't have a fever, so.
Yeah.
So we'll wait. Boo-hoo, man, never been
Where are
talking.
they living?
Yeah.
You probably want that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Rolling park, I think. Roll park, rolling park, whatever, just roll.
it looks fine to me. Just a flash.
the good doctor is here. Or what do they say? The doctor is in? All right, very good.
Things have been said to me at various times.
Likewise, I'm sure. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Earlier today, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment announced that we now have 2,777 cases, confirmed positive cases of COVID-19. That is up 295 since yesterday. An additional 2 counties. Now we're up to 76 of 105 counties in Kansas. And there's actually been a reduction of 1 death from 112 yesterday to 111 a day. We believe that somebody had been misdiagnosed. And so we've removed that from the rolls. As you can see by the numbers, this has been a tough week with the highest number of new cases yet. But as Dr. Norman mentioned on Wednesday, we feel optimistic that Kansas is close to reaching its peak infection rate if we haven't already. If that is accurate, then we are headed toward the downward slope of this journey, and we should be able to proceed with our transition from response to recovery next week as planned. 3 efforts, all of which we've been discussing this week, will begin to move at once. First, we will work to develop a plan related to the CARES Act that ensures that we're leveraging those federal funds efficiently. We want to get those dollars into the Kansas economy as quickly as possible. Second, as I shared a couple of days ago, we will announce state guidance for safely reopening the Kansas economy in phases. We've had ongoing conversations with stakeholders, and we're incorporating their feedback into the final plan. Once this plan is finalized next week, we will share it with all Kansans. Third, and what weighs pretty heavily on my mind today, we must identify a strategy for managing state cash flow and for addressing an imminent budget crisis, which came into sharper focus on Monday with the stunning announcement that a $1.27 billion shortfall looms. My budget director and I have been working through a deep dive of the new fiscal projections this week in an effort to wrap our arms around this new reality. I will phrase my analysis straightforwardly. The slowdown in the economy brought on by the spread of COVID-19 has caused our state's budget situation to deteriorate rapidly. If we want to protect all the progress we've made in recent years in our schools, in our correction systems, in our infrastructure, and more, then Kansas will need help to make it through this. With that in mind, I want to commend our federal delegation for supporting the latest coronavirus emergency relief package, which made its way through Congress yesterday evening. This package will inject more aid into the Paycheck Protection Program for Kansas small businesses, in addition to economic injury disaster loans and grants. It provides much-needed funding for hospitals that have been forced to scale back while simultaneously investing in expensive COVID-19 response efforts. And perhaps most importantly, the latest federal package boosts funding for expanded testing capacity. As we've discussed at multiple points, this will be a crucial metric in determining when it is safe for Kansas to begin reopening our state economy. While I truly appreciate our federal delegation's support of these relief packages, I must also convey the urgent need for additional federal funding in the form of direct, flexible state aid. The CARES Act dwarfs any emergency aid package enacted by the United States Congress ever. That includes the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Unfortunately, what the CARES Act offers in size, it lacks in flexibility. I am gravely concerned that Kansas is prohibited from using CARES Act funds to replace general fund revenue. I cannot overstate the severity of the budget crisis on the horizon to both the state and local units of government. If the federal government fails to act, we will be forced to make very deep cuts to critical services. There is a key difference between the $1 billion in cuts Kansas made during the Great Recession and the over $1 billion shortfall Kansas faces today as a result of coronavirus. The Great Recession cuts were brutal, but they occurred gradually. This gave communities time to adapt and prioritize so that they could limit the damage done to Kansas families as much as possible. Without direct aid from the federal government, Kansas will be forced to make all of those cuts in just one budget cycle. As I reflected on the fiscal saga Kansas endured throughout the last decade and all the tough, necessary decisions we've made in recent years to rebuild our state, I became alarmed and frustrated by recent suggestions at the federal level that states simply file for bankruptcy. I don't even know what that means. Kansas has made its share of fiscal mistakes in the past, but we closed the chapter on fiscal recklessness when I took my oath of office. As governor, I have diligently worked to put Kansas's fiscal house in order. Throughout my first 2 years in office, I offered structurally balanced budgets, one of which provided for the largest ending balance in 2 decades. I proposed paying off debt, and I made politically difficult decisions to veto large, unaffordable tax cuts. I also denied new spending requests for a wide range of programs that I wholeheartedly support, and I did so in an effort to ensure Kansas could weather an economic downturn when that moment arrived. Because, as I said from my very first week in office, it wasn't a matter of if Kansas would face another economic downturn, it was a matter of when and how bad. But no one, not even the federal government, anticipated a downturn of this scale or at this speed. Today, I issued a letter to our federal delegation conveying the severity of our fiscal forecast and what it means for our communities. I've requested their urgent support of an additional COVID-19 emergency relief package that includes flexible, direct state aid. Coronavirus has impacted every facet of our lives and therefore every line item in the budget. Our ability to recover from this public health pandemic and revive our state economy hinges upon the state's ability to pay its bills. Kansas communities rightfully expect state government to fund public education. They expect a strong public health system, public safety, a safety net for seniors, and an adequate technology infrastructure to ensure that public resources will be accessed in a timely manner. Without flexible federal aid, Kansas will find itself unable to fulfill these obligations when they are needed most. I mentioned a moment ago that Kansas's transition from response to recovery involves 3 immediate to-dos: a plan for reopening our economy, a structure for efficiently, strategically making CARES Act funding available, and a strategy for mitigating a severe, sudden budget crisis. These may be 3 separate undertakings, but they're all connected and equally essential to our long-term economic recovery. This national emergency has required a response effort, including the close coordination of local, state, and federal partners. Our recovery will be no different. And with that, I will turn it over to the Secretary of Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Dr. Lee Norman.
Thank you, Governor Kelly. Today, the state is currently monitoring 52 clusters. 19 are in long-term care facilities that account for 377 cases and 63 deaths. 2 group living arrangements with 28 cases and 0 deaths. 1 in the correctional facility at Lansing with 82 cases and 0 deaths. 2 in healthcare facilities with 16 cases and 0 deaths. 5 religious gatherings with 88 cases and 8 deaths. There are 17 in private companies, and in response to the question on Wednesday, the companies are quite a range. The one thing they have in common is that in those companies that the people were close to each other, and I think there's something to be learned by that, of course. Everything from manufacturing plants to a candy store. 99 cases and 4 deaths. And then, of course, the thing that's really accounting for our uptick in cases now that you see is in 6 meatpacking plants with 250 cases and 0 deaths. We have CDC staff, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from Atlanta, staff that have landed in Kansas and are here. They have started attending our incident command meetings, and 3 staff are already located in southwest Kansas working with the meatpacking plants directly. We have 4 additional ones here in Topeka to work with our epidemiology and our lab staff. They've been already very helpful additions to our team. Swabs. We now have swabs coming in, as I mentioned on 2 days ago. Our lab has received its first shipment of 3D printed swabs, and there's, I think, fairly good assurance that that won't be a rate limiting factor on testing. Regarding testing, and I've used this term, and when you've asked me before about how do we survey populations of people, not just the ill people. I think we have what we need to take care of people with symptoms and people that are ill to do the testing. And we certainly have the hospital capacity. Governor Kelly and I have spent a number of hours with various hospital and clinical leaders, and we have seen a nice drop in the number of hospitalized critical care and ventilated patients. So that's been a real encouraging trend line. Which allows us to start shifting our ideology over from only taking care of the people that are symptomatic and ill to testing populations of people. We're getting to that point now with our testing equipment availability. One of the metrics we're following is how many tests per 1,000 per county, because as per Governor Kelly's comments, we look at statewide numbers, of course, in aggregate, but Kansas is a very heterogeneous state. And we will always drill down county by county to help the local officials, the local health officers and health departments to understand what the disease patterns are through their county. We know that we need to get to 5 tests per 1,000 population to understand from an epidemiologic perspective the disease burden and the likelihood of transmission of diseases county by county by county. And we are well beyond that in the 5 per 1,000 in many counties already. And now with the added manpower from CDC and otherwise, with the added testing materials, with the added swabs, and the promise, and hopefully it will be manifest, of cartridges and reagents, bright future for the testing throughout the state of Kansas. So that's a market different than what I reported to you on a week ago. We do have very encouraging numbers in terms of hospitalizations and deaths per capita. We are on the improving side of that. Now, we haven't had enough days and weeks to know that with 100% certainty, but the trend line is very favorable. I think it's important to understand that we might continue for a while because of increasing testing capacity to have more positive tests and more positive in aggregate numbers, but also in tests per capita. I see that as a very good thing, because that means we know where the enemy is and how to go out and really drive it into submission. So more testing, higher numbers should not be perceived as a negative thing, but it'll help us to be one more tool in our toolkit for really getting great control of this COVID-19. That's it of my prepared comments.
Very good. Questions?
Secretary, is part of the increase in the larger increase this week because some labs weren't reporting?
Yes.
How is it possible that some labs didn't realize they had to report? I mean, this is so high profile, we're literally counting every single day. How would some labs not know they have to report? Yeah,
the question is, why did some labs, and in this case, the primary one is a commercial lab, didn't report? Don't know why. We're digging into that. We do know those numbers now, but it's important that you know that those represent a pretty small percentage of the overall tests, both negative and positive, that we've already received.
But was it a significant part of the increase this week?
No, that was from Southwest Kansas.
That's mostly Southwest.
Yeah.
Would you say the rest of the state that it's just Southwest is really increasing, it's the rest plateauing right now?
No, I wouldn't say that the rest is plateauing right now because of the fact we're doing increasing testing everywhere, increasing testing sites throughout the state. So I expect that it will continue to go up in gross numbers. But what we will see, I predict, is a lower percentage of positives. So the optimal would be we'd get more and more testing done, more and more negatives, and a lower and lower and lower percentage of positive tests.
Except for Southwest Kansas.
Yeah, and that has been a fascinating thing to watch unfold, and we've been in very close communication. A good colleague, friend of mine, Dr. Trotter in Dodge, and I are on the phone every day. That would be Ford County. And the people there have been remarkably, and this is exactly why we do the testing, they've been remarkably symptom-free. They've been mildly ill. The people we've been testing have had symptoms, but there's been nobody coming through that has been hospitalized or any deaths. What we have to be really careful about, though, is that, yes, they might be at the packing plants, and that's how they are identified, but they all go home to their communities. And that's why we need to continue with public health messaging and very close monitoring of where they are in their communities, because they have families and neighbors.
Governor, do you believe the legislature is going to come back, or are they going to force you to make allotments to take care of the budget issues we have?
Well, I think we'll find out if the legislature is coming back on May 6th when the Legislative Coordinating Council convenes again and makes that decision.
Do you have much confidence there?
It's a legislative decision, and I'll respect that.
Do you believe they fully understand if we're going to a zero budget, you have just almost unlimited authority?
You know, I believe that the Senate Ways and Means Committee and the House Appropriations Committee have been getting updated on the situation with the budget, and I am a firm believer that most of the legislators are extraordinarily responsible and good public servants, and they'll want to do their job.
Dr. Norman, could you explain what population testing would look like when we get to that?
Yes, there's really two broad strategies for testing. One is test ill people and then sequester them away through isolation and quarantine and test people around them. And then the other side of that, and we've started doing this in various locations around the state, are testing people that are not symptomatic. They don't have any knowledge of being exposed to anybody. They may not even particularly care whether they're tested or not, but we want to know, Joe Q. Public, how much disease is out there, meaning how many people, what percentage of people have become infected and are not symptomatic. Because that way we can know, are there hotspots? So we don't have to pay equal attention to 3 million people throughout 105 counties, but are there certain areas? I mean, some of these are just very obvious, and we're already working those. We talked about packing plants, nursing homes, group living situations, et cetera. Those are, at this point, no-brainers. But are there other ones that are kind of, we want to hotspot and find out where to pay more attention? And that's what population health is really about. It also gives us a better ability to forecast, because one of the things that we do not like to do is fly blind in terms of predicting, in terms of allocating resources. What that hotspotting does, or the population measurement does, is allow us to make better predictions and to align our resources accordingly.
So, you said that there have been 4 deaths at private businesses. Were any of those businesses that should have been closed under the governor's stay-at-home order?
No, it was businesses that had reason, based on the executive order, to be doing the business they were in. You know, there's one thing to have a rule, and there's another thing to comply. And I'm not even suggesting that the 4 deaths were because people didn't comply, because, you know, people have this big of a life at work, and they have this big of a life in their private lives. And I think that we oftentimes see where the work setting is a very controlled environment where people really follow the rules, but they don't necessarily do that in their own private lives.
Will this testing give you some information on whether you should reopen public schools to, I don't know what the term is, kids going to school?
Well, we have no plans, Martin, to reopen the schools during this particular school year. You know, we're going to just leave in place the continuous learning program that we put in place originally. So we will continue that. And we will use all the metrics working with our public health folks to determine, you know, what we need to do in the fall.
Governor,
If they open, would you have to test kids every day or every now and again?
Let me leave that to my public health official.
That would be one aspect of population health that would be worth knowing. And so the answer is a definite maybe. Because they can become infected. They oftentimes are not symptomatic, most of the times are not symptomatic, and can spread the disease. What I would hope for if we were doing population testing of young children would be to have the minimally invasive ones that we talked about 2 days ago, about the kind of work, the swabs can be done easily and at home or sent away so as to have minimal trauma and interruption of children, because we really care a lot about that.
Governor, if employees feel unsafe returning to work once your stay-at-home order has been lifted, are they still eligible to receive unemployment, and what is their best option?
Okay, so the question is, once we lift the stay-at-home order and a business reopens, but an employee feels unsafe going back to work, will they still be eligible for unemployment? We will deal with that on a case-by-case basis and make that determination.
Governor, what would you like to see when it comes from the federal government for funding to pay for state things? Is there an amount of money you'd like to see, and how do you weigh that with how much is the state's responsibility?
I think the National Governors Association has put in an ask for $500 billion for flexible state funding, and then that amount would be distributed on a formula basis that's generally given back to states based on a whole bunch of metrics.
Is there something, are there projects or whatever that you would like to focus on the most if you got money from the federal government to keep afloat in Kansas?
Well, you know, one of my highest priorities has always been education. So, you know, being able to fund our education, we need to fund our healthcare programs. I want very much to be able to continue to fund our infrastructure programs because, one, we need them, and they've been on hold for many years, and two, they're job creators, and so I'd like to be able to do that. I mean, if you think back even to the Depression, that was exactly what federal funding was used for. You know, it was for infrastructure projects like Works Progress Administration and the Conservation Corps, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You know, that they actually created jobs to get people back to work and build the economy. This is a little different issue because we have a health problem, and so, you know, the ability to put lots of people in one place working may not be as easy to do as it was back in those days, but I think by bringing the state's money with some flexibility, it will allow us to determine how to best invest that to maintain our critical services, but also to recover economically.
More than 100 deaths from COVID-19 in Kansas. Do we know how many have been healthcare workers?
I don't know that off the top of my head, except to say that I've not heard of a one, but I'm not going to give that as my definitive answer. But I have not heard of any healthcare workers dying in the state of Kansas. There have been healthcare workers infected.
Governor Kelly, this budget crisis it's not just unique to Kansas. Are you seeing other state governors asking for the same thing from the federal government?
Well, you should just watch the governor of New York during his press conferences, and yes, he has been. But all of the governors convene once a week via phone through the National Governors Association. That has been a topic of conversation, and all of the governors feel very strongly about this because everyone is experiencing this. You know, nobody was prepared for this kind of hit, this hard, this fast.
Even with a plan like that, would there still have to be cuts here that you're going to have to work out?
I don't have those numbers yet. You know, one, we don't know if it's going to come in, and two, once we get it in, then we'll need to match it up with our current budget.
And you'll have a plan next week, you're saying, for how to reopen the state or whatever the jargon is.
Yeah, we hope to have, by midweek, we've been meeting, as I said, you know, over the course of this week, and we'll continue that into next week, with a variety of stakeholders, you know, from the hospitality industry to just got off the phone today with the Kansas Chamber, and they had about 100 members on that call. Talked with the barbers and hairstylists today, whom I'm very anxious to get back to work. So we're talking with all of the various industry sectors. What's good news is that a lot of them have already given this a lot of thought, both on a state level and sometimes in concert with their national associations, and they're putting in their own guidelines for operating safely. To a T, they all recognize that while they really want to open their doors, they know that people will be somewhat fearful of re-entering life, and so they want to make sure that they've got everything in place to reassure the public that it is safe, you know, to go to that restaurant, that it is safe to go to your doctor's office for your appointment. So they're as concerned, if not even more, than we are about having those guidelines in place to allow us to safely reopen in a phased approach.
Governor, did any Kansas State offices receive inquiries yesterday or this morning asking whether injecting or ingesting disinfectants could help cure COVID-19? Per President Trump's press conference yesterday, is this safe? Would you suggest it?
Well, that's a health issue, so I'm going to punt that question to my health officer.
I have not heard that, but to that point, I had intended, and I probably still will call Dr. Steve Thornton, who is our toxicologist in the state of Kansas, who is the medical director of the Kansas Poison Control Center, and I plan to ask exactly that, because if we need to do counter messaging, I want to make sure we get right on top of that. I didn't answer your question quite right, Celia. I just realized there was, I know, one EMS provider who died, presumably from having contracted the illness during professional activities. I was answering as it relates to bedside providers, but I know there's been one EMT that has passed away because of the COVID.
Secretary, given that the trends in testing data are very complicated, because on the one hand, we've had a logjam, and then now we have more tests, so, the numbers will go up. Will you make public, presumably we're going to make a decision on reopening Kansas based on some sort of model. Will you make public the standard, if it's not, if it's not a specific goal, like we want to test this many Kansans, what is the standard when we know that we're on the downward trend and that we're safer?
Governor Kelly and I haven't talked about that expressly. It is my goal to have the metrics be transparent, and so that it makes sense, because it's, on the one hand, epidemiologic information and decision-making around it can be fairly complex, but I think what Governor Kelly's administration and I try to do is to make things that are understandable, so that when there's conclusions here, this is the rationale that led to that. So it would be my goal to make it understandable and very transparent as to the numbers, because numbers are just numbers. And I think that's something that we have always tried to have up to date, even, and very helpful on our website.
Dr. Norman, Sedgwick County hospitals believe they may have seen their peak. Despite the rise in confirmed positives, has Kansas reached its peak for COVID-19?
I think we have reached our peak in hospitalizations and in deaths. Again, I'll feel better saying that even another 7 days from now, when we can look back for a total of 14 days. The conundrum is around the total number of cases that could continue to go up, but the percentage of positives coming down, down, and down. I'm really optimistic with the numbers right now, but I don't want to speak prematurely.
When we've been talking about peak in the past to reopen the state, have we been talking about hospitalizations or the total number of cases?
Did you want to handle that, Governor? You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a really good question. Why focusing now on hospitalizations and deaths rather than just on the cases? And the reason is, if there's a body of infected people out there that are not being tested, we'll have a low number of cases, which is mildly reassuring. But hospitalized people are still going to be hospitalized, and unfortunately, some of those people that are quite ill will die. Those are going to be the same whether we're testing a lot of people or not very many people at all. So that is kind of a leading indicator, if you will, that I think we can hang our hat on very well.
Could the virus be diminishing in strength at all? Would that make any sense?
The question is, could the virus be diminishing in strength at all? That's how pandemic viruses tend to act. But we're not, it's too soon now to know that.
Governor, do you intend to have all your budget amendments done by the time the LCC comes back?
That would seem to be kind of a ground shifter, because if you've told them how to fix things the best way possible and they don't come back, then they haven't done any good.
Well, Martin, the Legislative Coordinating Council doesn't make the budget decisions. That would go to the full legislature. So, their coming back isn't really relevant. The issue is whether the full legislature comes back, and I'm not in control of that. I suppose I could call a special session, but I have no intentions of doing that. If they don't come back, if there are no changes, if we don't get the assistance that we need from the federal government, then yes, I will do the heavy lifting and determine where those cuts need to be made. But we're not in a position right now to even speculate because there are just too many unknowns.
And your administration seems to be the major voice one hears about if they don't expand or allow to go into the future your executive orders, that there may be a stutter step there with the federal government. Is there any more on that? Or?
Yeah, we've got, till May 1st for something to happen on that, and we are, as I've said before, we're exploring our options, and we are in discussion with FEMA to determine, what would happen should we hit that May 1st deadline with no legislative action.
But you have another one typed up. Another, typed up, I would presume.
You can go ahead and presume what you want, Martin.
Governor, how soon might casinos reopen as you try to restart the economy?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
How soon can casinos reopen as you try to restart the economy?
We will have guidance on that next week. As I've said, we've been getting together with all of the stakeholders to determine, what are reasonable base guidelines, and then superimpose industry-specific guidelines. So casinos would fit into that industry-specific.
Secretary, you talked about the improvement in getting testing supplies. Does that just affect testing by public agencies, or if I, go to my local private hospital, some people have been running into the issue where they can't get a test, or they find out it'll take 7 days to get the results. Will that also get better?
It will all get better. There's more hospitals that are running it, tests. They have to have competencies at a certain level to be certified to do this kind of testing. But there's still, and an ever increasing actually, number of testing locations with multiple different testing platforms. So it's going to get better all across the board.
One more question?
Governor, did you, I saw you tweeted about the New York letter, New Northeast Kansas farmer. What was your thought of that?
Well, I just thought, who better than a Kansan to do something like that? You're talking about the farmer from Northeast Kansas who sent the one N95 mask, one of 5 that he had left over from his farming business, to Governor Cuomo in New York. I thought that was priceless and precious, and I actually just left a voicemail for him on his phone. I hope to talk with him and thank him personally for that gesture. It just, one, it was just kind, but 2, it really makes Kansas look good, doesn't it?
Thank you.